Just an outline of what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk a little bit about industry-sponsored clinical trials versus grant-sponsored, core principles for budgeting, budget development, budget negotiation, budget risk analysis, and then we'll have closing thoughts and a time for you to ask any questions. Next. So when you're talking about, an industry clinical trial versus a grant, there's always this degree of uncertainty when you're talking about how many patients are we going to have, how many visits are we going to have, and the budgeting is a little bit different for both. And today we're really going to focus on industry-sponsored clinical trials, but we just wanted to draw out the comparison. And really, it's about the work first, money second. Clinical trial accounts are set up in WISR as a $0 budget, and budget is increased as payments are received. In industry clinical trial budgets, staff are not salaried at a % effort. It's usually based on milestone visits. And invoicing is typically done by the department and not RSP, as is typical in a grant. Next, everything costs money. This slide was put together actually by Jenny Dawson, and I just loved it, so I kept it in my part. And that is just that, like, you have to think about everything when you're talking about budgeting for a clinical trial. It's not just the support of your coordinators and your regulatory team. It's all the patient procedures that you need to think about, data entry, and are we going to provide any, reimbursement for patients for travel? Are we going to send them to other outside labs? So you have to think about all of these things. And so this slide is really just a visual of all the different things that we need to think about when we're budgeting. Next. So someone has to pay the bills. Industry sponsors should cover all costs associated with running their trial. They will get exclusive financial benefit if the trial is successful. And as a state institution, UW should not subsidize the cost of research for a multi-million, billion-dollar corporation. And so really it's about covering our costs here at UW and not subsidizing the research for the pharmaceutical company or the device company. Also, though, there are times when the department does add in funding or support for their investigator-initiated trials or, studies that are underfunded. Next. So one of the first things that I do when we're looking at participating in a clinical trial prior to our budget negotiations is I really talk to the PI and the clinical care team and make sure that we're all in agreement that this is a study that is feasible, is the scientific question of interest to clinical practice, because really that's what it's about. We want to improve our patient outcomes and improve the lives of our patients. Also, will the study contribute to present or future improvements in patient health? Does UW have the appropriate research population? Nothing is worse than starting a clinical trial where we just can't enroll because we don't have the population. Does UW and the sponsor agree on enrollment goals? If the sponsor wants you to enroll 5 people a month, but the PI says we only see 2 people a month, what kind of discussion do we need to have around that? And then does UW have the resources available to conduct the study successfully? Next. Some budget draft proposal pro tips is as you're starting your budget draft, you just want to develop a good rapport with your sponsor contact. Really be transparent with them up front on the timeline. And also just start the budget negotiation process as early as possible to avoid rushing. So don't sit on it. Really kind of start working on it right away. So as questions come up, you can ask your sponsor. One of the things that I wanted to mention is that the sponsor usually gives you a budget template to work on, and they have values and costs in there, but they are never what we would ever, accept at UW, because we're not an average site. Um, and the budget proposals are always so low that come from the sponsor. So one of the things that is worth asking is that asking the sponsor how much room there is for negotiation before really just sinking a lot of time and effort into your budget negotiation. One of the things too is just to be consistent with your past and future budgets. If you always mark up patient procedures by 20%, then continue to do that. If you always ask for certain administrative fees, do that. You don't want the sponsor to come back and say, well, you've never asked for this before, or it wasn't this high last time we budgeted to our work together. So just be really consistent. And then most importantly, base your UW budget on the protocol. And all of the three of us speaking today, we all like to use our own budget template. It's really up to you, but I think you can control your own template much better. Next. So budget development, create an internal budget to capture all your UW costs. So really, to ensure that all costs are incorporated into your budget, the following documents should be obtained from your sponsor or CRO. You want to have your clinical trial agreement and then an unlocked budget template. You want to have protocol, consent forms, any FDA documentation if it's an IND or an IDE study, any investigational drug brochures. The pharmacy will want to see those, PRC, and any study manuals as well. Lab manuals are extremely helpful when you're budgeting for a new clinical trial, because then you can see if samples are going to be going to a central lab, if they're going to be drawn locally. So those are all important documents to have. Next. Another thing to consider as well is billing compliance, and this, you'll go through this process after when you go through your ancillary service review, but CMS has rules about what can and can't be billed to Medicare as part of a clinical trial. So UW applies CMS rules to all patients. Commercial insurance usually also follows CMS. So Medicare coverage analysis is done to determine which clinical procedures can be billed to insurance. And all trials that have at least one clinical procedure must have a study calendar built in OnCore and undergo billing compliance review. Next. Medicare coverage analysis process should be completed before you draft your budget. Anything that can't be billed must be covered by the sponsor. PI can weigh in on what is routine care in the patient population, but the final decision really depends on the CMS, on whether CMS has rules related to the study procedures. For example, it may be a routine care to get a pregnancy test, ECG at screening, but CMS rules don't allow those items to be billed. So UW Health Research Compliance has the final say on what is billable and what is not. Next slide. So one of the first steps that I usually do is I will meet with my PI, and we'll take the protocol calendar and we'll sit down and I'll say, what do you believe is research and what do you believe is standard of care? And so we'll sit down. A lot of times too, we'll also look at maybe inpatient order sets or outpatient order sets for the population. But we'll sit down and we'll fill out protocol calendar and we'll highlight anything that we think is research only, and at what time points they're research only. Next slide. And then what I'll typically do is I will go ahead and build the OnCore calendar. Rarely do we ever have trials that don't have any clinical procedures. So I'm usually always doing an OnCore record for any new clinical trials. And so I'll build out the calendar, and based on what my PI or the clinical care team and I talked about as being research versus standard of care is how I'll build my calendar. So if you see in the snapshot here, anything marked with an S, we think is standard of care. Anything marked with an X is what we think is research at those time points. And then once you have your calendar built, you can send that off for ancillary service review, where a billing compliance review will be done by Nancy Lutz and her team. And there are times that that team has come back and said, well, you know what, I don't think XYZ is standard of care at this time point. So then I know, okay, I got to change that in my calendar, and then that's something I'm going to ask the sponsor to provide reimbursement for. Next. So once we know like what procedures are research and that we would like the sponsor to provide compensation for, there is a way to look up the charge master research rates for clinical procedures. There's a couple different ways. You can either do this in the financials console once your calendar is built in OnCore, or if you don't create your calendar first, you can also just go to the report tool in OnCore and search by the procedure name or the CPT code. So for example, I just showed you, if I was looking up the lactate blood test, you can see from the first snapshot is of OnCore in the financials tab. It shows the retail and the research cost. And then the second is from the actual charge master lookup report. So you can see that they match up. Also, just making sure you want to make sure you're on the most current charge master when you're looking up costs. And then industry indirect rate on all clinical trial costs. It was 28%. We just found out this morning that this is now going to be 30%. So that's what you want to be adding on to anything that you put in your budget as an indirect cost that the sponsor will need to pay. Next. One of the next things that I do is I like to calculate what is going to be the study coordinator effort. So this is one of my templates, but basically I will just list out, these are all the tasks that I know that our coordinators are going to have to do. We charge $100 an hour for coordinator support, and I will just basically task out everything. Okay, it's going to take us an hour to do informed consent. It's going to take us 2 hours to collect demographics, baseline, medical history. And, and then I just multiply it out, add in the indirect so that the sponsor has our final costs for coordinator support. Next. Next thing we want to do is make sure that we're putting in all our administrative management fees. Jenny and I have been a part of a budget template working group that's been meeting over the past year. And we are all piloting a new budget template right now that will be really shared amongst all of SMPH soon. And what we did is we agreed on what administrative management fees are needed for all studies. And then we came up with backup documentation and, kind of ranges of prices that we think would be fair to ask for. So some of the ones I listed here are the ones that I always ask for. One is a study activation fee or a startup fee. Annual maintenance fees. This covers, everything from administrative help to financial help. Study coordinator training. We all know that our coordinators have to train on EDC. They have to train on maybe, different workflows, the SIV, all these things that they do. So there's a flat fee for that. IRB fees. Data management, we invoice for that quarterly. Screening. A lot of times budgets are built where they're totally based on milestones, but if you don't enroll anyone, you could really see yourself in a deficit. So we also have a screening fee, which covers the time that coordinators spend going through clinic schedules and trying to recruit patients. SAE reporting, monitoring visits, because as much as I'd like to say our monitors just come and leave us alone all day, they don't. So we have a flat fee for monitoring visits. That's around $400 or $500. If we have to develop order sets, we charge for that. Any correspondence, and then of course closeout fees and document storage and archival. Next. So just a snapshot of what it might look like in a budget. Our median activation price for like a intermediate clinical trial is $10,500. And then you can kind of see the different things below. And what I'll do for our sponsors is I'll estimate out like this is how many, based on if they say like that accrual is going to be for 2 years and that will probably have another year of being open. Like I try to estimate it out. So they really do know the true costs of the total clinical trial. Next. All right. I think, Jenny, is this your section?
This is me. This is me.
Okay, wait, is there any questions about anything I said? Do we need to answer questions, or are we going to do that all at the end?
Lisa, yeah, there is one here that hasn't been answered. Is there an easier way to find procedure costs outside of OnCore while building a budget?
We have to use OnCore because that is how our billing is done at the university and at UW Health for UW Health. So when a patient has that procedure, our coordinators are filling out a billing slip that goes to our special billing team, who then charge either the study account or the patient based on that calendar. So we really do need to use those charge master prices. Does that make sense? Does that answer the person's question?
I wanted to make a comment that sometimes I'll go to the charge master and charge master lookup, and I will print off a bunch of stuff that I know that I'm going to be using in ophthalmology in our department, so that I have it as a quick reference, because sometimes trying to find things in the charge master can be a little daunting, frustrating at times, but that's just the way I do it. Sometimes it's easier to get some printouts just so I have it until the charge master gets updated and changes too.
This is Jana. I just wanted to follow up on the increase in indirect to 30%. There was an answer that said that went into effect in January, but I was under the impression that didn't start until the new fiscal year for July 1st.
I think we all were under that impression. And this morning at the RAND meeting, Betsy Nugent came to present some updates, and it is actually effective January 1st. So going forward.
But any ongoing budgets that you're doing, even if you haven't submitted them to WISC yet, but you're done negotiating them, they will honor the 28%. So it's just for any items that you're getting that are brand new at this point.
Yeah, good question, Jana.
Well, yeah, I mean, because I didn't want to say under the impression, I was told it didn't start until July 1st. Yeah. So, okay.
We heard different information this morning.
That's good to know. Thank you.
Okay. So I'm going to turn it over to Jenny Dawson Tibbetts.
Okay, I think there's another question about trials involving Meritor for procedures. As far as I know, our charge master does not include Meritor pricing, so you would have to talk with somebody over at Meritor to figure out what your pricing would be for procedures over there. And I don't actually know the answer to whose compliance review would be. If you're running it at both sites, whose compliance review would be, hopefully they'd be the same, right? But if Meritor is sending out their own bills, they may have different opinions on what's standard of care or not. Yeah, I don't know the answer to that question. We could maybe look into it a little bit. Okay, so I'm going to talk about budget negotiation. So once you have developed your internal budget, normally the sponsor will provide you with a budget template of their own design that they want you to use. Hopefully it's an Excel document, although sometimes we do get Word documents that are more difficult to sort of redline and keep track of changes and things. So normally what we do is if we get the template from the sponsor, first we check to make sure the Excel file is unlocked and we have access to all of the functionality. So if we need to highlight things or update formulas or things like that, that we're able to do that. And then second of all, if they send a template that is a super detailed, like here's all of our visits and here's all of our procedures, and we want you to fill out this huge grid cell by cell, we will go back and ask them if we can do what we call a totals only budget, where we just negotiate a total amount for every visit to sort of shorten up the time that it takes us to revise their template and sort of speed up negotiation. Sometimes they will say yes, sometimes they say no. If they insist on seeing all the procedures and all the time points, it's really important to make sure that you are matching the standard of care time points exactly as they are in OnCore. Because if you miss one, if it's standard of care in OnCore, but you leave it marked as sponsor paid in the contract, that's going to get caught on a billing audit by Nancy and her team, and they're going to want you to pay for all that stuff because the contract says you're getting money for it, and that looks like double billing. So it's really important to make sure that you match those up. And then, like Lisa said, the templates are sometimes junk. So don't be afraid to make as many edits as you want to that template. If something's missing that you think needs to be there, add it in. Check all the formulas. We have had instances where the sponsor will total up all the line items and calculate overhead, but they leave out a subsection. They don't sometimes want to pay overhead on staff fees, so they'll leave those cells out of the calculation, but we need overhead on everything. So just make sure that their formula is capturing everything. When we make changes, we try to be consistent in terms of the colors we choose and the way that we edit text, so that it's easy when we send it back to the sponsor to say, we made some edits, the colors, the cells in orange or whatever, those are the ones we changed to standard of care. These blue ones are counter offers. We made changes to text, they're red, and that makes it easier for them to kind of look at that. Rochelle, can you go to the next one, please? Thank you. While you're doing this process, your budget may end up way higher than theirs, and that's okay. Like Lisa said, a lot of times we get pretty low numbers, especially from sponsors that we've never worked with before. That doesn't exempt the big names from coming to us with low numbers. They're likely using some kind of a database like Grant Plan or something similar that collects data from executed contracts from many sites across the country, from, I don't know, however long ago, that it's a huge database of different things. And they will pull prices out of the database and they will see what the average is, and they'll offer you something less than average. So it's okay if your budget is higher. Always put in what you really need or what you really want. And always, start a little bit higher, because you're going to send it back and they're going to say, no way, you have to lower it. So you need to leave yourself room to come down a little bit there. Okay, can we go next one, please? So once you have your template the way you want it, you send it back to your sponsor. We find that it helps to sort of anticipate questions or issues with the budget. And we provide a lot of memos and justification up front. The pilot fees that are being used are, I think Betsy said, effective July 1st. They want all departments to be using those. If you're not part of the pilot program and you want to see them, you can reach out and ask for copies of that stuff. We have a couple of department memos that we use for justification on things like biopsies that have multiple bits and pieces in them that are required, sedation, image guidance, those kinds of things, where the sponsor's database system maybe just gives them a single CPT code for a biopsy and they make you an offer, but it doesn't include things like sedation and drugs and supplies and recovery room and things like that. So we have memos that kind of go over those things. Sometimes we use previous contracts. Sometimes we don't do that right up front, but later if we're having problems, we may try to pull a previous contract. And then sometimes it helps if we're like really high, like way higher than them, we try to figure out why. And usually for cancer trials, it's something to do with CRU fees or lots of PKs or serial triplicate ECGs, because those triplicate ECGs are charged as 3 separate ones. And if you have 6 sets of 3, that's 18 ECGs, it really drives up the price. And I guess on the flip side, if your budget's lower than theirs, try to figure out why, just to make sure we didn't like overlook something in our OnCore build. But a lot of times maybe they want to pay for chemotherapy infusion or things like that that we have listed as standard of care. And then the other thing we have is a template sort of letterhead memo. If they come back and they want documentation of a price, we just have a template, we plug it in and say, here it is, it's on paper, it's on letterhead, do what you want with that. So, okay, next. And then I guess while you're negotiating, along with having, hopefully you have a decent rapport with your colleague on the other side here, and just be patient with them, because at least, when you start off, just try to be a little bit patient, because they maybe have never worked on a side of research before. They don't really know how things work, maybe at an academic center like us. We do a lot of educating and explanation and justification of why things cost what they do. And, it's better to just, assume the positive intent and try to be patient with them, so that you usually get farther that way. Most people probably have heard a sponsor say that we're the most expensive site they've ever seen in their whole life. We've had sponsors tell us, other sites in your area are doing this for X% less than this. That's good for them, but we don't have any knowledge of other sites' costs, and we're not allowed to. really ask other sites what they charge for certain things. And our budget is based on our specific sites, costs and fees. So that's usually what we tell them, like, this is specific to us. And what's being charged to us internally. We don't shy away from, I don't want to say playing the blame game, but we'll say, well, this is what PRC is going to charge us, so you need to pay for that. Or UW Health sets these costs. Like, that's not for us to negotiate. We can only go so far. If you are talking with a sponsor, we need a counteroffer in writing, that we have that as a policy. We don't, like, we will have a phone call if they have questions about stuff, but we don't haggle on the phone. If they want something to be lowered, they need to provide a specific in writing request for that, so that we can evaluate those things. Okay, next please. Again, so sponsor maybe doesn't want to pay for a certain fee. They don't like the name. They have a policy that they don't pay for fees that are called this. For the administrative fees that are part of the pilot program, those are non-negotiable. And part of the document that has the justification for those fees does say these are non-negotiable. But what we can do is rename things or bundle it together with other things. Just so as long as we have the money in there somewhere, that's something that we can wiggle on with them as far as what it's called. Procedure costs, again, they're set by UW Health. Sometimes all we need to do is put the cost on our template memo that says, these are the costs. I forgot what the wording is, something like these are usual and customary, or something like that. Just, these are the typical fees that are charged to an industry sponsored clinical trial here at UW. And here they are, here's the cost. Sometimes that's really all they need. We've had sponsors tell us that, they need it in writing. They have compliance concerns about, if our budget is 3 times higher than every other site budget, that's a flag for their auditing on their side. And they just need, they need us to provide something to explain that these are what the costs are, that they're not secretly trying to give us kickbacks by giving us a budget that's 3 times higher. So sometimes all they need is something on a memo. All that being said, just be careful how low you go with things. They will use it against you in the future. So you may be able to take something lower and offset it somewhere else, but just know that that's going to go in a contract that may be pulled out the next time you work with that sponsor. And then again, at the end of the day, I have busted out this line about, we're state funded, we're publicly funded. We cannot be offsetting the cost of your research, Merck or Pfizer or whoever. Like, this is your study, this is what your protocol requires, this is what it costs, and we're not going to be in the business of using state funded dollars to offset the cost of that for you. Usually that helps, move the needle and kind of let them know they're being a little bit unreasonable. Okay, next one, please. Payment terms. This is something else that you'll need to negotiate in addition to the actual budget numbers. RSP does not negotiate payment terms, even though they are part of the contract. So you just really need to know about them and what they say and make sure that works for you. So the schedule of the visit payments, if that's going to be automatically paid or if you have to invoice, make sure that's clear. Screen failures, how they want you to do invoicing, the rules of invoicing. A lot of times they'll say you have to invoice something within 90 days or 6 months of it occurring, and we just strike that out because something's always going to get overlooked. We're always going to get behind on things. If it was done and the study is still, 5 years later, maybe not, but if the study is still ongoing, we're still doing this work, it shouldn't matter. We did the work, they should pay us. So just kind of be careful about that. And then timelines for final invoicing, holdback. We try not to accept holdback. Why should they get to keep some of our money? And then a lot of times they want to pay by ACH, which we do accept. UW does accept that. Just be aware that all of those wire payments go into one deposit account, and they don't always have enough detail for RSP to figure out where to post them. So we usually get a couple emails a week or every couple of weeks from Ellen at RSP asking us if we know where this payment goes, and we check and see if we have an invoice that matches the dollar amount, and if not, we reach out to IQVIA and say, what is this for? Sometimes it's for us, sometimes it's not for us. So it can be hard for RSP to process those, so just be aware of that. Okay, this is just a plug for OnCore. At the Cancer Center, we use OnCore for as much as we can. We build obviously calendars in there, our patient visits are tracked in there, and we also use it to develop our internal budget and then record the final budget, and we do all of our invoicing out of there for studies that are 2016 and newer. It's a huge improvement over manually doing that stuff in Excel, especially if your studies are somewhat complex. So it's just sort of a plug for that OnCore is available. It's a tool you can use, and it really will give you some good benefits into your post-award section of being able to do invoices and reconcile. When you get payments, you can reconcile that against what you were expecting to be paid. So OnCore will sort of generate a list for you based on visits. Here's your visits, here's your invoiceable items that you're supposed to be paid for. And then you can kind of use that to reconcile. So it's been really awesome for us to use that. And it gives you some different payables and reporting tool options as well. So just a potential tool for people to use for budgeting. And next one, please. Okay, I'm going to hand it over to other Jenny to talk about budget risk.
Hey, I'm the other Jenny. Basically, I want to talk about, do you know your risks when you're negotiating a budget, and how can you mitigate those risks? We're going to talk a little bit about finalizing your budget negotiations, reviewing it with the PI and getting department buy-in. Basically, is the funding that you're getting from the sponsor worth the cost to perform the study? One way that you can mitigate that risk or see what you're doing is by creating an internal budget tool. Next slide. So this is terrible and you can't see it, but my point with this is that everybody has to create their own tools. This is the tool that I use in ophthalmology. And it gives me a way to identify any financial hazards that might happen. So let's take a little bit of a deeper dive and break it down. Next slide. A good startup budget sets the tone and helps, especially if recruitment is low. So this is the first part of my budget tool. And I want to make sure that I'm getting on the left-hand side as many startup charges listed as I can. I'm going to list the actual cost, what it's actually costing me to do these things, or my unit. And then I'm going to list what the sponsor negotiated payment is. And then as you can see in the box on the far right, what your total startup revenue is minus your startup costs and indirects, you're ending up with a pretty good net profit just from your startup at the end of that. The new budget template tool that we have coming out will help you a lot with this step in the process. Next slide. So then we're looking at the procedures. This is basically what you need to get to cover your personnel and procedure costs. So I make sure that I write down every event that is in the sponsor calendar. You know, a lot of times when you get the sponsor's budget, sometimes there are procedures in the calendar that are not in the budget. And you need to bring that up to the sponsor because all of your effort needs to be covered. So you want to double check that. Write down, you know, list all your events or procedures, how many times you're going to have to do the procedures, what you negotiated with the sponsor for the procedures, and then a column for your hospital costs. Ophthalmology does the majority of all of our procedures ourselves, so I never have a lot in this column, but some of you may have that. What you want to charge for your personnel rate, what it's going to cost for your time to do the procedures. Even though you have a line item at the bottom that for a study coordinator fee, I want to make sure that I'm getting enough for each procedure as well. And then basically it's just math from that point on to where you get to the anticipated margin over and under for the budget. Next slide. So it all flows down into this. And what I like to do is to create, you know, a best case scenario, what's expected, and the worst case scenario. So with this particular budget, you can see the worst case scenario is that we don't end up recruiting. But as much as that sucks, we know that we're still going to be okay financially at the end of it because we created a pretty good startup budget with this. The expected scenario, even better, because we're going to be getting the sponsor payments for the procedures that we're doing. So you want to make sure that you're getting enough of those procedures to be able to, you know, cover yourself with that. There are going to be times that you're going to run into budgets that don't look this great and you're not able to get what you need. This is where you can go back and identify areas that have caused problems and hazards. Figure out what's working in the budget and what's not. Next slide. So hazard, this is what you've ended up with on a particular trial. And, you know, if you take a look at it, obviously your startup payments aren't covering what you need. The sponsor's not paying enough for the procedures that you need. Your bottom line is if you don't recruit any patients, you're going to lose money. If you recruit patients, you're going to lose more money. So what's the incentive to recruit there? So do you just say, forget it, throw in the towel and walk away? Not necessarily. There are things that you can do to help, you know, figure out ways to maybe make this look a little bit better. Next slide. So what's next? First thing I would do would be to go back to the sponsor and negotiate. Second, have that discussion with your PI. Third, look for other sources of funding. Next slide. So you go back to the sponsor. You want to make sure that when you're talking to the CRO, they all have caps on all their costs. And if what you're asking for the budget falls underneath that cap, they're going to approve it no matter what. But you don't want to be under their cap. You want to make sure that you're getting what you need, regardless of what their cap is. And they're going to say, well, then I'm going to have to escalate this to the sponsor for approval. That's okay. Let them do that. You can wait. It might delay it, but it's worth the wait if you're going to be able to get what you can. The other thing is that sponsors and CROs want to look at the big picture. At the end of the day, they just want to meet their budget. So again, go back to what Jenny was talking about and see if you can just give them a per patient number. Sometimes it's better that they are not, you know, analyzing what you're asking for each little procedure, because they're going to say, well, we don't normally pay that for that, or they're going to really analyze that. So sometimes it's better if you can just give them one number to cover just what you need for the patient. Don't be afraid to rob from Peter to pay Paul. If you think that a sponsor won't go for an expensive line item, charge more for other procedures. That's where you want to do what I said previously, is get that per patient number. You know, sometimes they're going to say, well, we're not going to pay that much for, you know, this, but they will pay a lot more for something else. So it doesn't matter as long as you're going to make what you need at the end. And what's in a name? Don't be afraid to call a procedure, budgetary item a different name or lump things together. An example would be one of the new items that we're looking at is something called a technology access fee. Sponsors don't know what that is. Even if you give them a justification, they kind of give a little bit of pushback, and you'll say that, you know, you need it, blah, blah, blah. And they'll say, well, can I lump it into your startup? Absolutely. You do whatever you need to do as long as I get the money. I don't care. So it's okay to go ahead and move things around, do what you can to renegotiate with the sponsor. Next slide. All right, then you have to have that discussion with the PI. Sometimes it's not a great discussion. You're going to take the budget to your PI. Let's say you were able to get a little bit more from the sponsor, but you still didn't get what you wanted. You go to the PI and you're saying the budget's not good. The PI is going to say, well, but it's very scientifically interesting. I want to do this, or I need to do this for political reasons. These are the questions that you have to ask and the discussions you have to have with your PI. You know, are they married to this trial? Do they really want to do it? Do we really, really have a sufficient caseload of patients that we're going to be able to recruit this with this? Because you're putting a lot of time and effort into negotiating this as well, and you want to make sure that's covered. Sometimes there's another phase. This is a phase 2 trial. Sometimes there's a phase 3 trial, and the PI knows that more likely than not, if you're involved in the phase 2, the sponsor is going to come back to you and want you as a site for phase 3. So there's many reasons. So at the end of the day, the PI has said, you know, yes, we need to do this. Okay, next slide. So then what? Is the risk worth the reward? Can you supplement? You know, you never want to tell a sponsor that you're going to subsidize their trial. However, in some cases, if there are some of the, you know, really small new startup companies that, you know, don't have huge backing behind them, there are some things that you can do. We have what we call as a funds distribution committee in our department. It's interdepartmental funding that we have. I can fill out an application and ask for a little bit of money to help fund this trial. Maybe when you talk to the physician, they say that, well, I have some startup funding left over from when I came onto the university. We can use that to help supplement. Sometimes you have big residuals left over from other trials with the same PI that you can work out to be able to use those residuals to help supplement some of your lower trials. And there's also ICTR grants and things that you can do. Next slide. So going back to the study, let's say you were able to get an additional $2,200 or so from the sponsor. You were able to get maybe $2,400 internally. You were able to rearrange a few things to make it work. So you look at this again, and really just by getting an additional $5,000, which in the grand scheme of things isn't that much, but you'll be able to see that just by doing that, it changes your risk with this study a lot. You know, you'll know that if you expect to recruit 5 patients, you're still going to lose, but you're not going to lose much, and you're going to come closer to breaking even. So then you just have to make that decision. Is it worth it? You know, and if the PI is super interested in this and wants to do this, and we know that we have the patients, at least you know that you can move forward, and it's not going to be, you know, a tremendous risk. Next slide. So some closing thoughts. Basically, you want to know your protocol. You want to know what department fees that you need to put in. You know, what are your unit fees? What do you have to have? And what are the other UW fees that you're going to need to pay for this? Develop your own internal tools. Make sure that you have an internal budget. Make sure that you have some memo templates and some justifications on letterhead that you can send to the sponsor. Don't be afraid to negotiate with the sponsor. Most of them expect it. So, you know, come up with the cost that you need, and it's a hard line. Don't move from that. They just push them. They'll budge. They really will. It might not seem like it, but they will negotiate with you. make sure that you're consistent. You don't want to negotiate the study with the same sponsor, and then in a year from now, the sponsor comes back and says, yeah, well, last time you didn't need this. So make sure that you get the costs that you need and that you stay consistent with that throughout your life of negotiating. OnCore can be very helpful for some of the complex trials, especially for setting up and using post-award. And then find some resources that you can use within SMPH. Next slide. These are some of the resources that you can use to help you with some of your budgeting. Also, feel free to reach out to Jenny, Lisa, and I. All three of us have been doing this for a long time. So we really don't mind, helping you if you have a difficult budget, or if a sponsor's, being a pain in the butt. We're happy to give you some ideas of what might make it a little bit easier on you. All right, questions? Let's see.
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. If anyone, we've got a few minutes left here. If anybody has any questions, feel free to drop in the chat. I know we've had some really great questions so far, and I think they've all mostly been answered. But if you have any questions you want to drop in the chat, or feel free to unmute. I'll just give you a minute or two of uncomfortable silence.
Yeah, this is Linda. I'll fill up that uncomfortable silence for just a moment. First of all, Jenny, and Lisa, thank you so much for this presentation. I learned a lot, and I've been working with you on the budget stuff. So in addition to them being a wealth of knowledge, they're also involved in the pilot that we referred to. And I know there were some questions in the chat regarding what this pilot is. And a lot of the fees that were just discussed are inclusive of what we're considering those mandatory fees, or what we're also referring to as a standardized budget template, to help with ensuring that we recoup those fees and that we are able to plan for and budget and be able to negotiate accordingly with our sponsors on for industry sponsored trials. So these three folks have also been involved in that pilot, and I've noted some of the questions, because one of the things that we are going to be doing very soon in our next meeting is to review kind of the lessons learned, what the findings have been with the pilot, some of the questions that I saw on the chat as well, we've included in the feedback, to be able to then ascertain, how best do we roll this out and implement this, and how do we ensure consistency? So just because we've got that template out there, how do we support that and ensure consistency, as well as some of the tips you heard today? If the sponsor doesn't completely understand or agree with a particular line item as to what it's called, how do we address that? So that is also some of the discussions that we'll be talking about as part of the pilot findings, and then how do we best roll this out and support this across SMPH. So I will stop there, but just also wanted to shout out to Jenny, and Lisa, who have been very involved in the template work and have done a great job and been a great resource for that team.